So most of this week, I have been looking towards this Sunday, not excited to preach. It feels like there are things that need saying out loud that in the dark hours of the night feel like they shouldn't need to be said out loud. Aren't they obvious? And I guess the answer is no, they're not obvious. And so they will be said out loud. There's a few things about today. I think if we've got any social science types out there, I think that there is a PhD study to be made on the landscape of Christianity in the United States and the voting colors of various districts based on whether the Christian community predominantly uses a lectionary or instead uses the pastor's short list of favorite verses during a year. You'll hear me occasionally say, gosh, I don't like the readings that are assigned from today, and we're stuck with them. Well, the readings that we have for today are a part of the Revised Common Lectionary, which I know you were just hoping I was going to say Revised Common Lectionary this morning. But this lectionary was created over 40 years ago. Before that, there was another lectionary. There's been a lectionary for centuries upon centuries. So 40 some odd years ago, there was a group of learned people of various Christian traditions that sat down and said, you know what, in 2025, on the 26th of January, the gospel text for that day should be that Jesus announces, quoting Isaiah, that I am bringing good news to the poor. That should be the gospel text for this day. And so here we are with this gospel text assigned. Now, it's a struggle because in our nation, there has been a fierce war going on for, well, one would say the 1860s were pretty bad, but maybe since the 1600s on what it means to be an American, and I think importantly in this time and place, what it means to be a Christian. And part of this debate and part of this warring back and forth depends on the willingness of some people to not speak and simply be silent. That's not tenable. And this last week, we heard somebody speak when she was supposed to stay quiet. Bishop Buddy of the Washington, D.C. Diocese of the Episcopal Church spoke to our new president in a way that dramatically offended many Christians in the United States for saying something that I think is curious on a number of levels. First off, it was striking to me how rare that kind of interchange is at all. Generally speaking, we're very careful to cultivate the circles that we move through to make sure that everybody is on the same page so that we don't have surprises like that. It happens regardless of your affiliation or where you are. We kind of like staying with our own crowd. And so that was kind of striking just in and of itself. Another piece that was striking was the response to the bishop. Often did not include the use of her title or even her name. I find that interesting because there is an attitude, particularly about women in the church and perhaps women in general, that seems pervasive as a feature as opposed to a bug. When we talk about the life of the Christian in our nation, it's a real struggle because we have been up and down and all over the place, and I would be the first to admit that our tradition has not by any means been blameless. But it seems to me like kindness, mercy, compassion, empathy, these are not things that should be controversial, but apparently they show weakness. Weakness. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Weakness. We have a real conflict in how we understand Christianity. Is Christianity power over others? There are a lot of things that just kind of lay on top of each other right now. We have this gospel reading. We have this sense of concern for those who are oppressed. We have executive actions this last week that have targeted members of our congregation directly, currently. This is hard. This is painful. This is a difficult time to be the church. And I think one of the things that I found interesting in this last week, and I have to admit, I know some of you probably watch every minute of every nomination, Senate hearing. I'm not one of those people, but I almost missed hearing about the new Secretary of Defense's tattoo. Maybe that's a staple in all nomination processes, but I only watched the one that he was involved in. He has a tattoo of a cross. I could show it to you. I have one on actually one of my other stoles. It's probably one of the more famous crosses in Christian tradition. There is the Latin cross, which is kind of got the long tail and then the equal ends, which is probably the one that you see the most, particularly in Protestant churches. But there is one that's associated with Jerusalem. It's called the Jerusalem cross, and it looks like a plus sign. It's equal like this, and traditionally has small crosses in each of the quadrants. And the secretary was asked about this, and he very rightly stated that this is a cross that is a part of Christian tradition and is seen on the floor of the National Cathedral and on the front of the bulletin at Jimmy Carter's memorial service. All true, all true. However, its main historical legacy is from the shields of the Crusaders. That is the main reference of that. Now, it could be that the secretary got this tattoo out of a reverence for the Beatitudes, and blessed are the merciful, and blessed are the meek, blessed are those who grieve. But I suspect that Crusader tradition over and against others is a piece of that. And conflating that with Christianity is a difficult piece. Every year, when the lectionary cycle begins, it begins roughly around Thanksgiving time frame. It's the first Sunday in Advent. When we look at our resources for worship, often these resources have been written months in advance. As you might imagine, there's a team, there's an editor, they go through all kinds of things. And I wanted to share, I don't normally have notes, I wanted to make sure I got it right. As I said at the other service, it's not that I don't care if it's not right the other weeks, but this one was a little longer. But so this was written about a year ago, and it was written in relationship to this gospel reading here. What do we say this day to the people before us, meaning preachers and you? The chaotic and toxic environment in which we live calls us to name the things that disturbed us the last 7 days, meaning since last Sunday. But you can feel how that sounds different this morning. Racial turmoil, mass shootings, political bickering, war, rhetoric, demeaning LGBTQ folks, the low wages of migrant workers, the ravages of climate change, necessary medical care denied, people left unhoused, suicide, the refugee crisis. We look in the mirror and admit our roles in these troubles. That is the honesty to which the law drives us. Then we receive the gospel, grace, free, and undeserved. It's interesting to me when we look at the power of the lectionary and how it lays over our lives and news at a certain point. And we can feel the power of it. For one, you are silent like you rarely are during my sermons. Not that you're a rowdy crowd. But I sense that there is this moment that we are in, this trying to understand what it means to be a person of faith in this time and place. Between services, I heard back from somebody in the congregation on my sermon from the first service. They had watched it online and was voting to have the word evangelical removed from the name of our denomination. So just if you're curious, that actually is a little bit of a conversation right now. It's a European reference that's completely lost on us in this country. But when we seek an understanding of what does it mean to be Christian in this place, the Jerusalem cross in some ways reminds us that Christianity comes in all kinds of different stripes and colors. We think of the Palestinian Christian community. We think of all different stripes of Orthodox and Protestant and Roman Catholic. We think of a broad kaleidoscope. It is not black and white. Or do I say it is not binary, perhaps? Correct? There is a sense that when we look at the Christian faith, we gather together recognizing that within the broader family, there are going to be disagreements. There are going to be differences of view. But it's hard to understand if mercy and kindness should be in that basket of disagreements. We just buried Jimmy Carter, and there are differences of thoughts as to the effectiveness of his presidential term, perhaps, but I don't know anybody who doesn't think he was a model of what it meant to be a Christian in this life. If we think back a few years back to the death of Pastor Fred Rogers, famously known as Mr. Rogers, right? We need more Freds. We need more Jimmys. We need less, "This is Sparta," in this country. We need a lot less of it. The examples being lifted up as models of behavior and leadership, and I think particularly for our young men, is sad. It is very sad. I think one of the things that was interesting as I was thinking of all of these layers on things was an observation, I should say, that is burned into the minds of the German people. It is a global remembrance that is largely moved past without any thought in the United States, which is tomorrow's observance of the Holocaust. This is, as you might imagine, a big piece of the equation, but it is an example of an era where leaders of faith and leaders of political power were closely adjacent. And historically, in the life of the church, those have not been our best moments. As we move through this week, I think that we can imagine the story as we have it today. Jesus quoting from Isaiah and stating that the good news is coming to the poor, the outcast, etc. But we're also missing what happens next. What happens after this story is the people say, "We don't like what you're saying," and they try to kill him, is what happens. They take him to the brow of the hill to throw him off. And it's this great New Testament phrase where, and then he just went on his way. But when we think about this, we think of the release of prisoners this last week, some of them violent, and then the simultaneous lifting of protections for certain officials in the United States. We think of the challenges of people being so angry and so certain that they threaten violence to others. Some of you might recall from our trip to Germany several years ago, George Baum, Father George Baum, is one of the musicians in the duo Lost and Found. He is an Episcopal priest in Cleveland, Ohio, and he received a voice message raging at him because of what the Episcopal bishop in Washington, D.C. had stated. We have a member at the first service whose son works with her son, and they're having to manage the level of death threats that she's receiving. That's become normal as a part of our political discourse. So we could just go, what? And maybe we need a minute to do that. But I think when we think about the good news of Jesus Christ, the good news is found in all of us, coming together as the body of Christ. Maybe not always on the same page, maybe with different ideas about different things, but coming together and sharing bread and wine, becoming one body, and continuing to do the work that Christ has called us to be about, to be merciful, to bring good news to the poor, to free the oppressed. It continues to be the same work that it has always been. Amen.